to review a class that we had last night, which is very, very pertinent for each and every one of us, especially in today's world. We all know that each and every one of us, from time to time, and if not just from time to time, sometimes it's consistent, especially in the times that we're living in today, that we feel inundated by all these pressures, by all these. Some people tell me that they feel helpless in their life. And the question is, how do we change something that seems to be inevitable in our lives? There are forces that sometimes, when we view them from an individual perspective, seem to be so powerful and so overwhelming that many times, even before we attempt to try to resolve them, we seemingly give up. And when we attempt, if we do attempt to try to resolve them, we are met with constant ups and downs and in fluctuations to the extent that it seems that we are helpless and it's hopeless and there's no way that we can change anything. We all know that this week we're working on the very last of the 7 attributes in Sfirat Omer. As we discussed already for just about 7 weeks, the Sfirat Omer is the coursework that Hashem gave us upon leaving Egypt, that for 50 days after going out of Egypt, we were to work on our emotive selves, on illuminating our emotions. And that is because, as we discussed in the beginning of the Sfirat Omer, in Mitzrayim, each and every one of us was imprisoned. In other words, notwithstanding the external aspect of Egypt, the main prison that we discussed was the inner prison. The prison of hopelessness, loss of self, loss of identity, loss of purpose. As we discussed, a slave is nothing more than a byproduct of his master's whim. And as the Rebbe explains, the ultimate slavery is when a person is focused and pursues a life that doesn't belong to them. As we discussed in the Pesach classes, one of the most insidious form of slavery that Paro forced upon us is switching the male and female roles. He allotted females male tasks and allotted male female tasks. And as we discussed the Rebbe's question, seemingly that doesn't seem like slavery. Men could do what women can do, and women could do what men can do. However, while a person is able to perform, if they're not performing in order to express their true selves, then the performance of those might be successful, but internally they'll feel like a failure because they're not giving expression to their essential self. The parable that we brought at that class was, if Einstein was to be forced to sit in a third grade classroom, we obviously understand that even without cracking a book throughout the entire year, Einstein would have aced the entire grade. And now externally, he's getting A's, he's getting perfect. But internally, he'll feel trapped. He'll feel that what's the point of all of this? I don't see the purpose. I don't see what is it that I'm accomplishing. Egypt was the ultimate state of self-imprisonment. When Hashem revealed himself on the eve of the night before that we went out of Egypt, and ultimately broke the final straw of bondage, and then took each and every one of us out of Egypt, as Chassidus explains, what was taken out was our godly soul. because your ultimate self is our godly soul, our truest self. When a person says, I'm authentic to myself, I want to live my life, I have to be true to myself. There's a question mark that the person should ask. But what is me? Who am I? Am I really living my life, or am I living a life that was given to me by others? And we discussed this in the course of those last several weeks in our classes, in the Pirkei Avot classes, and so on and so forth. But henceforth, Hashem gave us a service of Sfirat Omer to illuminate our animalistic traits, our characteristics, one by one, for the duration of 7 weeks, being that there are 7 base emotions, Chesed, Gvura, Tiferes, Netzach, Hod, Yesod, and Malchut, and all of their inclusion, that each one of the emotions should not just bear, but include and fully utilize all the other emotions. And that could only occur, as we discussed, through introducing intellect into each one of the emotions. This week, we are now on the final emotion, Malchut, corresponds to the feet, obedience, royalty, speech. Yesterday was Netzach of Malchut, and today is Hod Shebamalchut. We all know that slavery, self-imposed slavery, in other words, notwithstanding the externalities, the external variables that surround us throughout our lives, the question is, what do I feel inside? How do I think inside? How do I communicate to myself? As we discussed, that liberation doesn't mean freedom. Liberation means that notwithstanding the external conditioning that I might live in, but the true self is alive, that I can be myself notwithstanding anything around me. And the ultimate slavery is being subjugated to the externality, their external conditions. Where does the liberation really start expressing itself? Specifically in the way we think, the way we communicate. We know the very famous story that is brought in Likutei Diburim, Volume 2, where the previous Rebbe discussed the power of thought and the power of imagination, and why the Rebbeim would hold in great esteem Hasidim with astute imaginations. And the Rebbe explains that. But in the course of that talk, the Rebbe brought a very, very foundational story, a story that we discuss in different classes, specifically the trust classes, how to overcome anxiety, internal anxiety. And the story is that the third Lubavitcher Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek, Rabbi Menachem Mendel, had a very prestigious chassid who together with his wife were barren for many years. And finally, they received a blessing from the Rebbe, and she conceived and gave birth. We could only imagine how elated they were, holding their child that they longed for, that they dreamed for, that they davened for. But at some point in their child's youth, he became very sick. The parents brought one doctor, another doctor, and each doctor gave the same prognosis. Your son is, God forbid, he's dying. he doesn't have too much long to live. Until the final doctor says, from my estimation, he might have maybe a day or 2 days at most. You could only imagine the heartbreak, how all their dreams and aspirations felt that they were shattered, as we discussed in yesterday's class. And so in a deep morose state, Reb Michael, the chassid of the Tzemach Tzedek, sat by the bedside of his son, bemoaning the fate of his son, feeling heartbroken and shattered. And one of his friends came to visit with him and asked him a very simple question. Did you travel to the Rebbe yet to ask for a bracha? And Reb Michael responded, travel to the Rebbe. The doctor says my son has a day or two to live. By the time I travel to Lubavitch, who knows if my son will still be alive? The friend looked at him with amazement. This is the definition, he says, of a chassid sheita, of a foolish chassid. So the chassid, Rebbe Chal, immediately got into his carriage and traveled to Lubavitch. By the time he came to Lubavitch, it was already late at night. And in his mind, he was thinking, what's the point? Perhaps my son had already passed away. When he entered the Rebbe's chambers, even before he was even able to ask for a blessing, he broke down with deep sob, wailing and wailing and wailing, crying and crying. When he finally composed himself and opened up to the Rebbe regarding the plight of his son and what the doctors, the prognosis that the doctors gave. Parenthetically, it's very important to insert here that the Rebbe many, many, many times stated in talks as well as correspondence that a doctor has no right to give a prognosis. Life is in the hand of Hashem. A doctor is there to facilitate life, and not to, God forbid, give the opposite. Anyway, the Tzemach Tzedek responded with one of the most foundational perspectives of Judaism. Trach gut v'tzai gut, the Rebbe told the Chassid. You think good and it will be good. You will dance with him in his wedding. And as we discussed in previous classes, by the time that the Chassid came back home, of course, his son had completely healed. The previous Rebbe continued that in raising his son, he incurred many challenges due to the different challenges that plagued the Jewish communities in Russia back then. But each time Rabbi Chal encountered a challenge in raising his son, he would close his eyes and recall that faithful yechidut with the Tzemach Tzedek, in which the Tzemach Tzedek told him to think good and it will be good. You will dance with him in his wedding. And indeed, Baruch Hashem, eventually Rabbi Chal did merit to dance with his son, who made complete tshuva in his son's wedding. And as we discussed in the class, seemingly the Rebbe should have given him a blessing. Refuah Shlema, your son should have a complete recovery, etc., etc. But the Rebbe gave him the key to reality. If you think good, then it will be good. And as we discussed in the classes, Chassidus explains that the garment of thought is a very, very powerful garment of the soul. In that, in Tehillim, David HaMelech says, Hashem tzilcha al yad yaminecha. Hashem is a shadow by your right hand. And the Zohar comments, explains that Hashem as a work is the shadow to the image of our thoughts, of the way we conduct ourselves down here. If a person thinks expansively and happily and joyfully and conducts and speaks in such a way and conducts himself in such a way, then Hashem opens all the channel of influence and influx, whether the person, even if the person didn't deserve it so much. And even if, God forbid, the person deserves the opposite. But thoughts generate our reality. We're not just helpless victims of our reality. We are, to a certain extent, co-creators with Hashem. And that begins the layer of thought. And incidentally, as we discussed in the trust class, when the Rebbe said, you think good and it will be good, from this we see that thoughts don't only affect our reality, but have and bear an effect on the reality of those around us. To the extent that the Rebbe told him, you think good that your son will be healed, that your son will completely recover, and he will grow up, and he'll get married, etc. That will bear an effect on your son. We can't comprehend how powerful our thoughts are. We as we discussed in one of our previous classes, Malchut is the attribute that brings all the previous attributes into practical reality. Chesed, Gvura, Tiferet, Netzach, Hod are all emotions, the way we feel. But in order for the feeling to have meaning, purpose, it has to be brought into the practice, into the actual. Hamaisu hu'ikar, the deed is the most important. Malchut is the attribute that brings all the previous emotions into their practical application. When it comes to chesed, Malchut brings the chesed into practice, that the person should speak kindly and speak generously, afford the compliments, afford the gratitude, and so on and so forth. Practically to help the other, their spouse, their children, their community, with their time, with their resources. Not just to say, I feel for you. If you feel, what are you doing about it? And when it comes to Gvura, to set actual boundaries, etc., as we discussed in previous classes. But nevertheless, Malchut is the attribute that gives a practical expression to each one of the previous emotions. Malchut also incorporates within it the three soul garments: Machshava, Dibur, U'Maaseh, thought, speech, and action. When we encounter challenges in our lives, where is the first key to the resolution of these challenges, or at least the ability to tackle these challenges according to the need of the challenge? First and foremost, it begins in the way we think. As we discussed in the Tanya class, the garment of thought is an internal communication mechanism. If we would gauge the type of thoughts we either initiate or entertain once they enter our minds throughout the day, can we say that our thoughts are positive? When we think about our own life, our own circumstances, our spouses, our children, our communities, what type of thoughts do we have? Because as we just said, thought is not just an assessment of reality, it's a co creator of reality. And so often, while we attempt to practically resolve the situation and we communicate outwardly positive words, no, it's going to be fine, we're going to make it, don't worry. But internally, what do we think? What type of thoughts do we allow? What kind of thoughts do we engage throughout the day? Do we focus on the dilemma or do we focus on the resolution? What kind of biases do we create within ourselves and double down on? As we discussed in our meditation class about a year and a half ago, the best analogy I ever heard regarding thoughts is like a fresh ski slope where the snow was very soft and smooth, and then the first skier skis down the slope down the mountain, and in skiing he creates treads in indents inside the snow. The next skier will also go down and create his treads. 3, 4, 10, 20. After the 20 to 30s, these treads are going to be fairly deep. And the subsequent skiers who are going to be traveling down the slope will inevitably get caught in these treads and have to follow that path unless they're expert skiers knowing how to get out of those treads. So too, the neurologist explains that the more we think a certain manner, the deeper the tread, the deeper the pattern becomes, to the extent that inevitably every single thought, even if it starts out positive, will inevitably have to travel the same pathway we always travel until we start questioning, why do I think this way? Is this conducive? Will this type of thought bear the purposeful results that I'm looking for, that is needed for me, that is needed for this situation? The famous adage that we shared several times, including last night: mind your thoughts, they become your words. Mind your words, they become your emotions. Mind your emotions, they become your actions. Mind your actions, they become your habit. Mind your habits, for they become your life. All begins with the way and the style that we think. So if we're meeting repeated, I don't want to say failures. There's no such thing. But if we're meeting repeated impediments, we have to first assess our internal communication style, our thinking. And when a negative thought seems to stream right into our mind, we have to We have to divert our thoughts from this negativity. We have to replace it with another thought. We can't tell ourselves, don't think this is not good, this is not prudent. Because in that style of communication, internal communication, we're actually doubling down on those thoughts. We're giving those thoughts more strength. Rather, simply focus on something else. And we did several exercises to show how easy this is. So too, when it comes to the garment of speech, that the style of speech that we employ either serves as a key to open up our reality or as a lock to lock it further down. Shlomo HaMelech tells us, Da'aga belev ish yasichena. A worry and an anxiety in one's heart ought to be communicated. And we discussed in our nurturing relationship class how vital it is to have someone that we could communicate, that we could open up to. As we discussed last night, the Mishnah instructs us in Pirkei Avot, chapter 1, Aseh harav, appoint for yourself a mentor, one mentor that you could openly discuss your inner life with, without shame, someone that you could be vulnerable to, that you could listen, that they'll listen to you, and then from above to below, give you a form of work that could be done in order to be able to respond to the situation or to grow. Aseh harav ukneh lecha chaver, and acquire a friend. Acquire a friend means, first and foremost, regarding friendships, understand that they don't come free. That you have to acquire with your time, with your effort, with your words, with your presence. But nevertheless, as the Rebbe explained, while each person ought to have a mentor, appoint one mentor that you could communicate, but the mentor's instruction will come from above to below. As the mentor will be someone on a greater level than yourself. But at the same time, one must have a friend to discuss openly, without shame. And Mendel once in a Verbringen bemoaned the fact that the biggest issue that plagues us in our generation is we don't speak to each other. We don't communicate to each other. We barely say good morning, and as he mentioned, the good morning that we give most of the time is the good morning of Tisha B'Av. And Mendel instructed that no matter what, we should sit and talk. We should have times that we sit and talk in Verbringen. Because the fact that a person could talk in itself is therapeutic already. The fact that the person feels at least heard and understood, the fact that the person communicated outwardly is already part of the healing. And as Chassidus explains, the Sichena, although it means he should communicate, anxiety in one's heart should be communicated to someone else. And as we discussed in the nurturing relationship class, someone else outside of yourself, but someone else who will be receptive to listen to you. But the same word Yeshichenam could also means he should divert it from his mind. So the Chassidus explains, when you have a conversation with your friend about what you're feeling, what you're going through, That allows the person to start diverting their mind from being hyper-focused and obsessed with the situation. It helps a person, it alleviates the pressure that are internal bleak thoughts and emotions. In other words, a person might have an internal feeling of I'm blocked up, I'm not progressing, things I'm constantly encountering um, impediments in my life, and this is not going correctly, and this is not going correctly. Or perhaps internally, the person views themselves as helpless and hopeless. And that in itself is the greatest blockage that they have. Well, one of the ways to overcome this is to be able to communicate it to someone else. Open up the heart, release what's being trapped there. As we discuss in several of our classes, existence on the most rudimentary, basic level definition is that something occupies time and space. Currently, this space is being occupied, which by definition doesn't allow anything else to enter to that space because currently that space is being occupied by something else. In order to bring something else into this space, you would have to remove whatever is currently occupying it, and then you could bring something new. So too when it comes to our emotions. If our hearts are being occupied by negative and toxic emotions, then by definition, there's no room for anything else. And one of the ways to evacuate our hearts from those toxic emotions is simply to be able to communicate it to someone else. Now, not necessarily that the other person will be able to give you, your friend or whoever you're talking to may be able to give you a resolution for this. But the fact that you're already talking about it is part of the healing. And that's netzach shebedibur. As we discussed, malchus in itself is speech, the giving expression to everything that came before it. For this reason, netzach in thought, netzach in speech. Netzach means perseverance when a person is encountering internal struggles, internal conflicts, internal impediments. That's when netzach ought to be employed. So the question in thought is, do I think victorious thoughts? Do my thoughts and speech express perseverance and strength, not just resilience, as opposed to, God forbid, self-defeating thoughts, self-defeating words? The netzach shebemachus, the netzach shebemachus means, do we communicate in a victorious way? Because as Shlomo Melech teaches, Mavis v'chaim beyad halashon. The life, the death and life are in the hands of the tongue. That the way we communicate gives reality a practical tone. Thoughts create the energy of the reality. Speech solidifies that. So we discussed in the trust class when Moshe Rabbeinu came out in Parsha Shmot in the third Aliyah, Moshe Rabbeinu comes out from the palace to see the suffering of his brethren, and Moshe Rabbeinu sees an Egyptian taskmaster beating a Jewish servant, and Moshe Rabbeinu ends up uttering Hashem's name, causing the taskmaster's soul to depart him, saving the Jewish servant, and then burying him in the sand. And then very next day, Moshe Rabbeinu once again comes out to see the suffering of his brethren. And this time he sees the very same Jew that he helped the day before. But this time he's fighting with another Jew, and they're arguing, they're fighting with each other. And one picks up his hand and is about to strike the other, and Moshe Rabbeinu screams out, Rasha lama tekeres recha. Wicked one, why would you hit your friend? And how do they respond? He turns around and says to Moshe Rabbeinu, who died and made you boss? What do you think? We don't know who you are? You are pretending to be the son of Batya, Paro's daughter. But we all know that you are the son of Yocheved. What do you think would happen if we go and tell Paro that you murdered one of his taskmasters in order to save a Jewish servant? Incidentally, he was a Jewish servant that was saved the day before. And how did Moshe react? It says, "Vayira Moshe v'amar achenu dadavar." Moshe became frightened and said, "The matter has gotten known." So on one hand, in his inner self, his thoughts and his emotion, he felt frightened. But then he said it. The matter has gotten known. He gave those inner thoughts expression. And what's the very next part of the pasuk? And Paro heard about the matter of the taskmaster, etc., and sought to arrest and eventually execute Moshe. The Rebbe explains that the Torah is teaching us something very foundational about life. Had Moshe not allowed himself to internally become afraid, knowing that he saved a Jew, and Hashem won't allow anything to happen to him. Think good. And how much more so, had Moshe Rabbeinu not said those words, the matter has gotten known. The entire world could have heard about this. Paro would not have heard about it. Or even if Paro would have heard about it, Hashem would have distracted him with something else. But the fact that Moshe not only thought about it, he said it, is what gave power to Paro to hear about this. And that's the juxtaposition between these two. Vayira Moshe v'amar achenu dadavar and the Vishma Pari. That the Torah is telling us says what gave Paro the ability to hear about this. It was Moshe's thoughts and Moshe's fears and the fact that he communicated in such a way. And this is what Shlomo HaMelech means, that death and life are in the hand of the tongue. That speech, abra kedavra, I create as I speak. Speech creates the reality that we live in. Choose your words wisely. Choose your words from wisdom, from chokhmah, from bittul, not from the ego. And in our service to Hashem, the netzach of Malchut is employed in the time of our davening. As our sages interpret Masechet Ta'anit in the Talmud, the verse "Ulavdo b'chol levavchem," and to serve Him with all of your hearts. The Talmud says, which is a service of the heart? Talmud answers, tefillah, davening, is a service of the heart. Davening ought to inspire the love to Hashem, the awe towards Hashem. And when we plead with Hashem, as we learn from Hannah's davening in the book of Shmuel, who we learned the silent prayer from, when we plead with Hashem, it has to come from the depth of our hearts. And nevertheless, at the same time, we have to articulate the words out loud. Because, as our sages teach us, the sound, the speaking out loud arouses the inner intention. In other words, in saying the words of davening out loud arouses our inner emotions. It opens up the heart. It removes the blockages that set into the heart. Specifically, the blockages in serving God with joy and happiness. And finally, we have the Netzach Amachos as far as action. Ultimately, once we start conducting ourselves practically, day to day, consistently, in a positive and healthy manner, the action itself draws the positive thoughts and positive emotions. As we discuss in many classes, and even Baruch Hashem today, the world understands this. L'havdil, the Torah tells us this from the get-go. Achar ha'pe'ulot nimshachim alavavot, as it says in the Sefer Chinuch. After our emotions are drawn after our actions, which means that not always do our action reflect our emotions. Sometimes we could love someone but not act in a loving way towards them. However, emotions will always be drawn out and follow our actions. If we act repeatedly in a positive manner, loving manner, it will arouse those emotions. It will arouse those inner thoughts. So that's Netzach Shebamachut. We must assess the way that we internally communicate to ourselves, whether in thought or when we speak about our situations, and how we act when we're dealing with internal conflicts. Hod, which is today's attribute, focuses on overcoming external conflicts and impediments. But one of the greatest determining factor in the way that we either we react or respond to our external conflicts and impediments is the internal viewpoint for who we are. If we view ourselves internally as helpless and hopeless, then inevitably all the thoughts and the words and the actions that we take will bear the mark of that internal incongruency. As we discussed in last night's class, just several days away out of Israel, the Jewish people approached Moshe Rabbeinu and asked him, allow us to send scouts into the land to scout it out, to determine what kind of a land is this, and so on and so forth. And Moshe indeed selects 12 of the 12 leaders from amongst the Jewish people to go out and scout out the land. Each one was a tribal leader and righteous. But we all know when they came back and were debriefed in front of the Jewish people on Tisha B'Av, on the 9th of Av, after spending 40 days scouting the land through and through, they eventually come back and give the description of everything they saw. They didn't embellish one word, one attribute or one situation. They said, yes, there's great fruits and so on and so forth. However, there's also giants. And those giants are powerful. They're stronger than God. This is a land that consumes its inhabitants. And these giants viewed us as grasshoppers. We cannot enter the land. And as we know, that day was Tisha B'Av, and Hashem said, how much longer are you going to be testing me? What else could I do to show you that I'm with you, that you have nothing to worry about? For this reason, tonight you cried for nothing. Each generation on this night, I will give you what to cry about. Why did he cry? The Kotzker Rebbe, the Rebbe brings this in from a Sikha, that the Kotzker Rebbe interpreted the verse, we were grasshoppers in our eyes, and therefore, and we were grasshoppers in their eyes, to explain how did the Jewish people, how did the scouts know how the giants viewed them as? Rather, the Kotzker Rebbe explains, because we were grasshopper in our own eyes. In other words, our self-perception was that we are nobody and nothings. And so therefore we projected it onto the giants. The reason why they cried is because they felt defeated even before they entered the land. Why? Because they were not connected to their inner truths. Nobody asked them, can you or can't you enter the land? That wasn't a choice. That's a destiny. The reason why they were sent is to scout out strategic entry points of how we're going to enter, not if we're going to enter. But if a person has a negative self-image of themselves, they're not aware how good they are, how holy they are, that Hashem didn't make mistakes with them, then even before they enter the race, even before they enter the challenge, they already have a perception of inner failure. Hod is humility. As we discussed in one of our classes, the instruction is kedim reikim al tamid, don't diminish in empty vessels. As the Alter Rebbe interprets that, you must be yourself, make yourself an empty vessel. What does that mean? You have to rid yourself of your egocentric thoughts, your emotions. I can't, I will never, it will never happen, and so on and so forth. But you are still a vessel. You're a vessel for Hashem, but you have to be devoid of your ego. Hod Shebemachus is accepting that we're living in God's world, and every experience that we have a privilege and we get to experience is given to us directly out of Hashem's benevolence. Sometimes it feels very difficult, but Hashem has trust and belief in us. As we say every morning in davening, in Modanim, Rabbi Musecha, your faithfulness, Hashem, in me is great. You have faith in me to such an extent that you woke me up today. You have faith in my day today, in my abilities to charge the day and utilize every single moment of it in order to reveal the ultimate purpose for why I'm here, which is to make a dwelling place for you in this world, to bring Mashiach. It's difficult. Well, the more difficult it is, shows how much confidence Hashem has in you. But you must be you, and your true self as a piece of God. What's impossible for that? What's impossible if Hashem is giving it to you? If Hashem believes in you, rid yourself of this toxic nefesh bahamit, animal soul hod, which is, I can't, I'm a nobody, it'll never work out for me. See, I tried, and what's the point? It didn't work out. That's all nefesh bahamit hod. It's called misplaced humility. And utilize a godly soul's hod. I'm a piece of God that was sent into this world by God Himself. The world that I was sent to is being created every single instant anew out of Hashem's benevolence. And Hashem sent me into the world that He is currently creating with all of the challenges that I'm privy to, because that's how much He believes in me. For this question, we must ask ourselves, do I believe in me? As we discussed, that the Chozeh of Lublin explained that having faith in Hashem ultimately translates in having faith in yourself. If you have faith in Hashem, but you don't have faith in yourself, it means that your faith in Hashem is also not accurate. Because having faith in Hashem means I accept that everything that Hashem is real, that I have a real God who really believes in me to really do the right thing. Not just that God is great in Shemaim, but I'm not that. Having faith in Hashem means I have faith in me, that Hashem didn't just throw me into this world helplessly and hopelessly and haphazardly. And if Hashem has faith in me, I must have faith in me as well, and therefore I have to probe even deeper right now to discover which part of within myself, which talent has perhaps laid dormant and in a state of potential until this moment. But nevertheless, I must bring it out. But nevertheless, I accept this is God's world. I accept that I'm sent here by God, and I also accept that I'm equipped with the necessary strength and abilities in order to transform this moment into a moment of Mashiach. We'll continue this Mir session tomorrow.
Thank you, Rabbi. Have a good day, everyone.